There are few events in human history that so severed people from their historical, ecological, and cultural context like the Middle Passage. American slavery was hardly unique in its enslavement of people, but the immensity of the Middle Passage and the subsequent racialization of the Africans in the New World made the break from their previous culture unimaginably severe. It was a severance of apocalyptic proportions. New stories were required. The imagination of the enslaved Africans would be their salvation. To understand the immensity of the task of remaking a world, one must consider the completeness with which American slavery, and this is what made American slavery so uniquely brutal, eradicated the world view of the enslaved. This began with racializing them. That is, the slaves would henceforth be identified primarily by their racial caste. There was no possibility of full humanness for an African American in this system. They lost their names, their language, everything that gave their world meaning. Even family structure was disturbed by this system. Ironically, and not without controversy for some who would consider it to be the religion of the oppressor, a major way for the disparate groups who would come to be known as African Americans to deal with oppression and to reconstitute their world would be Christianity. Introduced to them by the radically egalitarian evangelical movement known as the First Great Awakening, the slaves saw quickly that the stories of the Bible were their stories. They were stories of a people enslaved seeking freedom, stories of a people disinherited seeking their rights, stories of a people pushed to the margins seeking their humanity. It was an act of collective creative genius to take the stories of their oppressors and turn them into stories of their own salvation. The Bible is a complex and inconsistent text. It has been used to justify racism and equality, slavery and freedom, capitalism and socialism, freedom fighters and colonists. That said, it is also true that if one steps back and takes the broader view, the major themes are clear. Sometimes, however, it takes the clarity of the outsider, the wisdom of the margins, to perceive the obvious. To the slaves, the Old Testament was a story of a people who were enslaved and found freedom in the Promised Land. The New Testament was a story of a man offering the possibility of freedom by reimagining the sacred and breaking the psychic barriers that divide us. Freedom. It was the word that would have meant the most to an enslaved people. Salvation could only be understood in those terms. For Jesus, the disinherited, to use Howard Thurman's term, were the Jews of Palestine who faced economic, political, and cultural oppression. In particular, it must be understood that Jesus not only was the member of a group who faced political oppression from Rome and cultural hegemony from the broader Hellenistic world, he was also near the bottom of that group economically. While the language of the Synoptic Gospels is not completely explicit about this, it is clear that his method of storytelling and his apocalyptic imagination is that of a man from the margins, from the bottom. His kingdom of God turned this world upside down, eradicating the barriers that excluded him and his people. This was not at all obvious to the plantation owner, but it was obvious to the slave. Jesus came from a tradition of the wisdom of the underclass. As a day laborer, he talked and broke bread with men who were barely scraping by, who were trapped in cycles of debt, who feared for their freedom and the sustenance of their families. The slave who heard the Sermon on the Mount would have heard the same yearnings Jesus felt. Who then is today's underclass? Who are the disinherited who could understand the perspective of Jesus most clearly? As in the time of Jesus, the issues of class and economic justice cannot be entirely isolated from other issues, such as race, ethnicity, and of course, ecology. But we will first identify three core groups who are marginalized due to economic conditions today.